There is a change taking place across francophone North Africa, and although you may not yet have heard about it, it is very much a spoken and not silent change. There is a formal shift towards speaking and teaching English as a language of prime importance alongside Arabic and French. I'm Charlotte Leslie, and I'm the director of the Conservative Middle East Council. As part of our series of podcasts with the British Council, I'm speaking to the British Council's Hamza Koudri in Algeria to talk about this change, what it means for the region, and for Anglophone countries and the UK in particular. Hamza, welcome.
Good morning. Thank you so much for having me today.
Could you just start by telling us a bit about yourself and the work that you do?
Sure. So I'm the country director for the British Council in Algeria, where we as British Council have been present at least since the 1980s, doing a lot of work to build cultural relations between the UK and Algeria. We do a lot of work specifically in three main fields, which are English, education, and culture and arts. And we do very similar work also across North Africa, mainly in Morocco and Tunisia, where we're also seeing the same sort of increase in demand for English language teaching. I'll start with arts, because then I know we'll focus a lot on English. So with arts, we try to leverage the UK expertise in different art sectors and build partnerships between those UK art institutions and artists and Algerian counterparts and other countries to, in order for them to sort of create events, create artwork that really reflects the cultural diversity on both ends. And then in education, we work a lot with, we're seen as a partner of expertise, and we work a lot with government institutions, mainly higher education and education. We try to build, also more of those ties between UK higher education institutions, universities, and then Algerian counterparts for more collaboration and partnerships in the research, in student mobility, and other fields of collaboration. We also work with, public schools and try to embed a lot of the technical training in STEM education through a coding project where we work with a lot of public schools in remote areas and increase the practical aspect of their IT teaching through microbit devices. And these are these cute little devices where students can collaborate to create, for example, it could be a watch, it could be a compass, it could be step counter. And it gives them a lot of practice opportunity in terms of developing their skills. And then, of course, English has always been key area of our work in the country, because we work with the government to train their teachers. We've worked on a number of reforms projects with the Ministry of National Education, and then we also have a teaching center that just caters for the community needs, and we have also assessments for those wanting to take IELTS, to study or work abroad. So that's also a very important part of our work. Like I said, we do similar work across, the Maghreb region, but also with some differences. Like, in Tunisia, there is a Skills for Success project that works on youth development. And then we also do vocational training a lot also in Morocco. So that's a bit of a brief on some of the work we do in this part of the world.
Thanks, Hamza. And one of the fascinating things happening is a push and an emphasis now on English speaking and teaching in schools that's happening not only in Algeria, but across Francophone North Africa. What has driven this emphasis and this sort of new focus on teaching and speaking English?
Yeah, and I think that's very much a topic of, everybody's talking about this increase in demand for English across the Maghreb. And also, it happens that recently the British Council published a Future of English sort of piece on the current and future trends. And then we're seeing across the world, there is this global increase because of, it's driven from the community, driven for, for professional and academic initiatives. And that, of course, is happening here. So we see, and I think at least for the last 10 years or so, it has been this community sort of drive to, to learn more English, to be sort of more in touch with the Anglophone sort of culture in general. And a lot of it is, youth trying to improve their academic potential, trying to have better job opportunities for international mobility a lot of the time, or cultural exchange, tourism. So for example, we get a lot of students, at our center, our exams, trying to pursue, academic opportunities, especially in the UK or other Anglophone countries. And so, of course, they will need English for that. Or even in Algeria, I think, recently there's been a tendency to go towards English because they realize, for example, at least 90% or more of academic research is published in English. And so in order to access those resources, it will be faster to do it in English. Otherwise, you'd have to wait for them to be translated into other languages. I actually remember one time there was this, psychology professor who was so keen on accessing the latest research. So she would always get the papers translated by English students because, she wanted to have access to it immediately and she couldn't wait. And so, but more recently, especially in the scientific fields, in medicine, in pharmacy, more of those people are pursuing English. They're teaching in English. There's been some universities that have initiated, for example, especially in oil industry, they've started to teach English. And then for professional purposes too, we see a lot of companies, British Council has been one of the employers, who has people working across the cluster with other colleagues across the world. And so having the English as a skill is a key requirement there.
I'm Charlotte Leslie, Director of the Conservative Middle East Council, and I'm talking to Hamza Koudri in Algeria from the British Council. Is this change driven primarily by civil society, or is it governments backing and pushing this change as well? What's the relationship?
So it's a little bit of both. And traditionally, when I say traditionally, in the last 10 years, it's been mostly the community. So you see parents, pushing their kids to learn more English, and they're taking them to after school programs or weekends, trying to expose them to more TV content or internet content in English because they see, especially I think the younger parents, they see the need for English, they see how important it is for academic and professional progress. So they're pushing their kids more towards that. And then the last few years, and that's also across the region, we see also the government taking initiatives. For example, the Ministry of National Education just started teaching English starting from third year in primary for the first time in Algeria. Traditionally, you would start teaching English at middle school, but now it's third year in primary. In Tunisia, likewise, they used to teach it starting from fifth year. Now they moved it up to the third year. And so also in, at the level of higher education, you see there was a lot of universities who were starting to teach subjects in English, medicine and, especially like usually the scientific fields more than the humanities. And then this, especially in Algeria, it is a presidential sort of priority. The president himself has been talking about this. And so that trickles down to all of the government institutions. We, at our teaching center, we get a lot of requests from, different ministries and a lot of also public government-owned companies that are hoping to teach their staff English to respond to this presidential sort of priority. And then we also see that also goes across the fields of also into the arts, because then you see lots of artists, like in terms of music, in terms of literature, people producing content in English as well. So yeah, it's very much both government and community driven.
And I mean, Algeria just geographically is a huge, huge place. What are the challenges in doing this? What are the challenges in shifting an emphasis to English in such an enormous country?
Yeah, definitely. I think you said it right there, is the size of the country itself is a major challenge, especially in terms of access. And so also it's a huge population. It's over 40 million people. And so any change like this would require a lot of foundational work to set the basis before you can sort of, meet the needs. And so, for example, we're working a lot with the Ministry of National Education to train a lot of the newly recruited teachers. This year, 4,000. And we're, rushing to train as many of those as possible. Just over the last 18 months, we've trained over 1,000 of those teachers who were recently recruited. A lot of them are fresh graduates. And so we're trying to give them the skills for that. It helps that we have been using an online platform for that because it increases access. Then you're able to actually impact a lot more people than you would if you're doing that in person with the limited resources. And then also we're able to cater for everybody across the country. Then there is a challenge of access to digital resources because, especially, for example, with AI, there's a lot of these tools, that would help the students and teachers. There's a lot of these resources that are available. But then access to technology, access to internet becomes a challenge. And then, of course, in any change, you always have the people who are so comfortable in their own routine and they're sort of like, they're afraid of change. They feel threatened. And so there's a little bit of not necessarily a pushback, but people sort of like reticent against this little change, especially, when we say teaching in English, it's always, people always look at English as a more fun way to teach as opposed to other languages. And so, as we train, people on using fun games and songs, more interactive approaches that teachers are not necessarily used to using in the classroom, I think that becomes a little bit of a challenge that we're trying to work through. But then, also in the future of English research, we talk about how there is a tendency to go back to indigenous languages, to the cultures. And so I think there is also a little bit of an expectation for English to deliver on that regard, to be able to, to be a vehicle of conveying a lot of messages that would also reflect the local culture. And so that's something I think that people are trying to grapple with. And then, for example, I gave you the example of university students, and these are youth that are not even obliged to be speaking in English. In my line of work, I get to go a lot to universities, and sometimes I'll be walking in hallways and you hear, a group of students hanging out in the hallways. They're not even in class. Nobody's obliging them to speak, but they're speaking in English. And it's interesting, they're speaking sort of like African-American accents because sort of like there's a whole cultural identification. And then that, I think, puts some pressure on English to be able to be used as a tool for those people to convey the messages that they probably wouldn't be comfortable talking about in their own context.
I'm Charlotte Leslie, Director of the Conservative Middle East Council, and I'm talking to Hamza Koudri in Algeria from the British Council. Is there a generational divide on this? Are younger people who are probably, I'm guessing, happier and more at home on the internet than perhaps the older generations, are they much more inclined to be pushing to speak English?
For sure, yeah. I think in general, especially I think since the beginning, it has been that kind of like, French versus English kind of thing. But I think the key message is, especially as we work, especially with the British Council, we're always trying to say, well, English is not here to replace any language, it's actually to give people an additional tool. So, and people in North Africa in general have been known for being polyglots. It's very common for people to speak at least 3 languages, if not more. And so this is just one additional sort of tool in your toolkit that you can use. And also, it's not an attempt to sort of replace any sort of generation or form. It's more to look to upgrade the skills as it's always necessary for people to access more opportunities. And so I think that's a conversation that's been had all over, on the street. And I think the fact that it's backed by government initiatives, I think it helps for people at least to find their own way and resources to upgrade their skills and be able to join the move. But yeah, definitely there is that whole generational sort of divide.
You touched briefly on the element of any kind of pushback, and it seems that there's both a kind of content pushback, that it's slightly new for some people in terms of what's being taught and how it's being taught, a bit more fun. But I want to ask about something perhaps a bit more delicate, is political pushback. We're speaking at a time where the diabolical war in Gaza, humanitarian disaster, is still ongoing after the horrific terrorist attacks of Hamas on October the 7th. And we are seeing political pushback against the West because of a perception of different treatment for different countries, to put it delicately. Is there any political pushback on the learning of English at such a difficult time politically, where the West, the US, the UK are experiencing political pushback from Arab countries?
That's a very good question, Charlotte, and I think you definitely touch on sort of like the general feel across the region. I think when it comes to English, though, and I think I always say this, in the last few years, English has always been sort of like, the ownership for English has been sort of like more universal, and so to be honest, we have not seen a decrease in the demand here. People are still going for English because they're not necessarily associating that with any specific country or policy. Because I think, you get an Algerian trying to speak to, somebody from India or Turkey or France. If it's France, he would be speaking in French. But for a lot of other countries, they would be using English as a medium of communication. So I think it's still seen as a tool to access those opportunities more than sort of like a cultural rapprochement of a thing, if that's one way to put it. And so yeah, I think the sentiment is very much there. People on the street are very angry. People on the street, they're sort of like, and they're using English to sort of to express their feelings about the situation in the region. but they're not necessarily sort of seeing English as they're not sort of like seeing English as the enemy in a way.
That kind of speaks to the role of culture, arts, the kind of thing the British Council concentrates on, being able to cut through political situations in a way that other things can't. Do you experience that as part of the British Council? Is the British Council able to have conversations and do things that perhaps a more, political body or entity might not be able to do? Is that the role of the cultural engagement that the British Council does?
Totally, definitely. And I think, that is the key sort of basis for any cultural relations work. It is to find areas of common interest more than areas of, disagreement or conflicts. I think, to find those common grounds where people can engage in a conversation. And so I think arts and culture are always fantastic tools for that. So for example, we were working on a project. So this is called Discretion, which is a book written by an Algerian author, written in French, published in France. We worked with Edinburgh Book Festival to put this into a theatrical performance. And so we're working also with an Algerian counterpart called Lach. And so the partners basically, I think it's a perfect exemplification of how we're bringing all of these elements of the culture together. So there is there's French, because it's very much still part of the Algerian history. But there's also the Algerian author, and it was translated into English, and so it was first performed in the UK before coming to Algeria. And so we're hoping to bring that in May. And when you see the people working on it, I think it's a perfect example of how regardless of everything going on, that cultural sphere is still a place for people to engage in a conversation around our history, around around art in general, because it also includes a little bit of singing and music and also theater in general. So I think it's a perfect example of that.
I'm Charlotte Leslie, and I'm speaking to Hamza Koudri from the British Council in Algeria. Hamza, we've discussed the enormous benefits that the British Council can bring to the table in terms of engaging culturally through arts, education, even during really difficult political times, and a movement in North Africa towards speaking English as a means to access global opportunities. Do you think the UK really appreciates the opportunities presented by a move towards speaking English? Algeria is a hugely important country. Is there more that we can do from our side to make the most of these opportunities opening up, both in terms of using the British Council or benefiting from the British Council's ability to talk culturally in difficult political times, and in the emphasis on English that is also going on?
Yeah, and I think that's a very important topic too. And definitely this expansion of English does create a lot of opportunities between the two countries in a lot of the fields. I mean, just for starters, I think we're seeing an increased demand for higher education opportunities in the UK. And so typically Algeria has not been sort of like a country of interest for a lot of UK universities, but over the last couple of years, as we engage with UK higher institutions, as they're seeing the opportunity, I think they're growing more interested in this. And so we see a lot more universities coming here to talk to students, to showcase the UK expertise in the field of higher education, and also to collaborate with Algerian universities in a number of partnerships. And so there's definitely an opportunity there. And then especially with France and Canada have been traditional recipients of Algerian students, receiving thousands of students every year. But recently there has been some restrictions on making it difficult for students to go study in these two countries. London is just two and a half hours away from Algiers, and then so there's that physical proximity, and then diaspora is growing. The Algerian diaspora in the UK is growing. So there's no reason for Algerians to only be going to France now with English. So it makes it easy to also access those opportunities. And then that also translates into other fields. So we're seeing there's also a lot of tendency to promote entrepreneurship in Algeria. And that opens up a lot of those economic exchanges between the UK and Algeria, because those people who traditionally have been speaking French, those people with leadership positions in the economic sector, now can open more doors for the UK because of the proximity of language. And that also touches on the second part of your question, is what can be done. And I think a lot of it is around increasing awareness and familiarity with the opportunity. As we're engaging with a lot of stakeholders in the UK sector, we're seeing that people do not really know and realize the opportunity that's going on here. And I think the more we sort of create those one-on-one discussions and hopefully broker more of those relationships, I think the more we're taking advantage of this opportunity in a way that benefits, I think, both ends, which is the ideal approach.
We've talked about how culture can cut through politics. Do you see there, and I don't know if you're going to be able to answer this, do you see there being political benefits to that cultural engagement in eventually beginning to bridge divides that have grown up so horrendously since October the 7th?
Well, I think definitely. I think the way you see it is, or the way I see it is, Algeria and the UK have enjoyed very positive relationships over, for the last decades, at least, if not across history. It's free from any colonial history. It's free from a lot of sort of the complexities that maybe can plague other relationships. And also, I think, Algeria is a key partner in terms of security and stability in the region, in terms of, fighting against illegal migration, in terms of the work around fighting climate change. And so that, I think, puts the two countries in a lot of close relationships, and they work really well together. And so culture, I think, is another way to boost that, and I think to bring that down to the people-to-people engagement, and that, I think, will generate a lot more opportunities for people to have open conversations, I think, around a lot of topics.
And finally, what would your message be to anyone who may be listening who hasn't visited Algeria, who doesn't see it as a place on their list of places to go and explore?
Well, I think recently it's been getting a lot of attention. So I think the desert is beautiful. So I would definitely welcome anybody who's interested in just exploring, visiting the country, seeing what it has to offer, and then just, going out on the street and talking to people and seeing what clicks and what might interest the UK sector, whether it's a higher education institution or artist or art institution. I think there's something for everybody to be focusing on, and I think it's this almost like this untapped part of the world. It's like a hidden gem that people have not had access to in the last few years, and so I think it's always exciting to have fresh perspective of the world from a different part of the world.
Hamza, at a time when things are really grim, it's been really encouraging to talk about an area where there actually seems to be hope and bridges to be built and opportunities to be had. So in the spirit of the podcast, thank you. Shukran, merci.
Thank you so much, Ola. Thank you for hosting me today.
Thank you.